In the final weeks of World War II, General George Patton gave an order so dangerous that he told his men to destroy every written record of it. And when Washington began asking questions, he looked his superiors in the eye and said nothing happened, because if the truth ever reached the wrong desk, it would not just end his career, it would unravel everything the Allies had built, and the men who followed that order knew it, which is why most of them carried the secret to their graves. The spring of 1945 smelled like ash and diesel fuel across the German countryside, and Sergeant Dale Whitmore had long stopped noticing either. He had been moving with Patton's Third Army for months, pushing east through rubble and resistance, watching towns surrender and soldiers drop their rifles in the mud. The war was not over yet, but everyone with eyes could see that it was dying, and dying fast. Whitmore was 31 years old, a man from rural Ohio who had worked coal before the army found him, and he had learned not to ask questions about orders that arrived without paperwork. The order came on a Tuesday morning in late April, delivered not by radio or written dispatch, but by a captain named Harold Voss, who drove up in a Jeep alone and pulled Whitmore aside from his platoon without explanation. Voss was not a man who wasted words. He told Whitmore that a convoy of German prisoners was being held at a processing camp 12 miles east, that a specific prisoner inside that camp needed to be moved before nightfall, and that no transfer documents would be prepared and no record of the movement would exist after it happened. Whitmore asked who authorized the move. Voss said the name and then waited for Whitmore's face to register what it meant. The name was Patton. Whitmore had heard stories, every soldier in the Third Army had, about the general making decisions that existed entirely outside the chain of command, decisions driven by instinct and fury and a strategic intelligence that operated 3 steps ahead of the official plan. But this felt different. Moving a prisoner off the books in the closing weeks of the war, when everyone was watching, when the press was embedded, when Washington had inspectors crawling through every camp looking for violations, this was not bold. This was dangerous. Whitmore drove to the camp with 2 men he trusted, Corporal Eugene Fry and Private James Aldous, neither of whom he told anything beyond the fact that they were collecting a prisoner and that they would speak to no one about it afterward. The camp was a converted farm, wires strung between fence posts, guards walking the perimeter in the gray morning light. The prisoner Whitmore was sent to retrieve was not a soldier. He was a scientist. His name was Dr. Friedrich Kessler, and he was 62 years old, thin as paper, with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that shook when the guards pushed him forward. Kessler spoke almost no English, and Whitmore spoke almost no German, but the doctor understood enough to know that what was happening to him was not standard procedure, and his eyes moved between the 3 Americans with something between fear and calculation. Whitmore put him in the back of the Jeep and drove west without stopping. He did not know yet what Kessler had done during the war. He did not know what Kessler knew. He only knew that Patton had sent for him personally, and that the order was already burning a hole through everything Whitmore believed about how armies were supposed to operate. They reached the farmhouse where Voss was waiting before noon. Kessler was taken inside, and the door was closed. Whitmore stood in the yard and lit a cigarette and told himself that this was the war, that strange things happened at the edges of wars, and that his job was not to understand the order, but to carry it out. But even as he thought it, something in his chest told him that this particular order was not going to stay quiet, and that he was now standing on the wrong side of a line he had not seen coming. By evening, 3 other soldiers arrived at the farmhouse with equipment Whitmore did not recognize: recording devices, technical instruments, boxes of documents in German that someone had clearly been carrying for a long time. Kessler was brought back out, seated at a table under a lamp, and for the next 4 hours a conversation happened in that farmhouse that Whitmore was not allowed to hear, conducted by a man in civilian clothes who had arrived in a separate vehicle and who never gave his name. Whitmore stood outside with Fry and said nothing. Aldous slept in the Jeep. The night was cold and still, and somewhere to the east they could hear the distant percussion of artillery, the war still finishing its last business. When the civilian finally came out, he handed Voss a sealed envelope and left without speaking. Voss put the envelope in his jacket and told Whitmore that the operation was complete and that it had never taken place. Whitmore nodded. He already understood that much. Subscribe for more forgotten German POW stories like this one. 3 days after the farmhouse meeting, a military intelligence officer named Major Richard Colby arrived at the Third Army's Forward Command post with a typed list of questions and the specific, practiced patience of a man who had been sent to find something he already suspected was there. Colby was not investigating Patton directly. That would have required authorization that nobody in Washington was quite willing to put their name on. But he was investigating the movement of prisoners through the camp 12 miles east, and his list included the name Friedrich Kessler. Whitmore was not present for Colby's initial meeting with the command staff, but the ripple of it reached him within hours. Fry came to find him at the motor pool with his jaw tight and his voice low and told him that someone from intelligence was at the post asking about a prisoner transfer from 4 days ago and that the name matched the man they had moved. Whitmore put down the wrench he was holding and thought carefully for a moment before he said anything at all. He told Fry to remember that no transfer had occurred. Fry looked at him for a long moment and then nodded and walked away. Colby eventually made his way through the command structure to Captain Voss, who received him professionally and answered every question with the particular blankness of a man who had been briefed on exactly what not to say. No transfer had been authorized. No prisoner by that name had been processed through the camp in question. The camp records showed nothing. The camp records, of course, showed nothing because the records had been handled the morning after the operation by a sergeant whose name Whitmore never learned and whose job had clearly been exactly that. What Whitmore did not know at this stage, and would not learn until much later, was that Kessler had been part of a German weapons research program that had produced documentation the American scientific establishment was desperate to acquire before the Soviets made contact with anyone who had been part of it. The civilian at the farmhouse had not been an interrogator. He had been a recruiter, and the conversation under the lamp had been an offer, and Kessler had accepted it. And by the time Colby was asking his careful questions, Kessler was already 300 miles west in a facility that officially did not exist. Patton's involvement was the problem, not the operation itself. Operations like it were happening across the European theater in those final weeks, quiet and fast, and deliberately undocumented. The problem was that Patton had inserted himself directly, had bypassed the intelligence apparatus entirely, had used his own men instead of the specialized units designed for exactly this kind of extraction. It was the kind of move that made the people in Washington who were already watching Patton very nervous. Colby stayed at the post for 2 days, and on the second day, he requested an interview with Whitmore. They sat in a tent with a folding table between them, and Colby placed his typed list on the table and went through it methodically, and Whitmore answered each question with the same steady blankness he had learned from watching Voss. He had not transported any prisoner. He had not visited any camp on that date. He had been with his platoon. Colby listened and wrote nothing down, and at the end of the interview looked at Whitmore the way a man looks at a locked door he cannot find the key for. After Colby left, Whitmore sat alone in the tent for a while. The pressure of the lie was not what he expected. It was not guilt exactly. It was more like the feeling of carrying something heavy in a direction he could not fully see, and not knowing yet whether the ground ahead was solid. 6 weeks after the farmhouse, with the war officially over and the Third Army in the slow, bureaucratic process of occupation and reorganization, a letter reached Whitmore through a route that should not have been possible. It was not in an envelope. It was folded into a standard Army supply manifest, tucked between requisition forms for vehicle parts, and it was written in careful, deliberate English that had clearly been composed by someone who knew the language academically, but had never spoken it naturally. The letter was from Kessler. It was 3 paragraphs long and said very little directly, but what it communicated clearly was that Kessler was alive, that he was in a facility in the American sector, that he was cooperating fully with the people who had recruited him, and that he was aware Whitmore had been the soldier who collected him from the camp. The third paragraph was the one that changed the weight of everything Whitmore was carrying. Kessler wrote that the research he had been part of during the war had produced results that had not yet been fully disclosed to the American military, and that there were documents still in German hands, or rather in the hands of individuals who had been part of the program and who had scattered when the Reich collapsed, and that one of those individuals was now in an American POW facility, and that Kessler believed this man would not cooperate with American intelligence willingly, but that he had known Whitmore's name, had been told about the farmhouse extraction, and was asking through back channels to speak specifically to the sergeant who had moved Kessler. Whitmore read the letter 3 times, then burned it. He reported to Voss the same afternoon. Voss read Whitmore's handwritten summary of the letter's contents and was quiet for a long time before he picked up the field telephone and made a call that Whitmore was not allowed to hear. 20 minutes later, Voss came back and told Whitmore that he needed to travel to a processing facility outside Munich, that he would go alone, that he would speak with a German prisoner named Werner Holtz, and that whatever Holtz said to him, Whitmore would return and report it verbatim, and that the conversation would not be recorded and would not appear in any document. Whitmore arrived at the facility the next morning. It was a large operation, thousands of prisoners, former soldiers and officials and party members sorted into categories by teams of exhausted American administrators who were clearly fighting their own battle against paperwork and scale. Holtz was in a separate section, a smaller compound inside the main one, reserved for prisoners whose status was still being evaluated. He was younger than Whitmore expected, perhaps 40, with a composed, watchful face and the posture of a man who had spent years in rooms where the wrong movement meant the wrong outcome. He sat across from Whitmore at a table and folded his hands and looked at the American sergeant with an expression that was not hostility but was very far from warmth. Holtz spoke English well. He told Whitmore, in a measured and unhurried voice, that he had been part of the same research program as Kessler, that his role had been logistics and documentation rather than science, and that he had in his possession, not physically but memorized, the location of a cache of documents buried outside a town in Bavaria that contained the complete technical records of the program's final phase, records that Kessler did not have access to and did not know existed. He said he would lead American personnel to the location on one condition. The condition had nothing to do with his own treatment or release. It concerned a woman, his sister, currently held in the Soviet zone, and he wanted her extracted before he gave anyone anything. Whitmore drove back and reported every word. By morning, the problem had moved several levels above him, and the operation that followed was one he would never be officially told about. But he would spend the next decade wondering whether the woman was ever found. 3 months into the occupation, a congressional aide named Thomas Greer arrived in Germany with a mandate from a Senate subcommittee that was investigating the handling of German scientific personnel in the final weeks of the war, and specifically the question of whether proper protocols had been followed in the extraction and recruitment of individuals with weapons research backgrounds. Greer was young, organized, and not intimidated by uniforms, and he had a list of names that included Friedrich Kessler. He also had a witness. The witness was Private James Aldous, who had been discharged from the Army 6 weeks earlier, had returned to his home in Georgia, had spoken to a journalist in his county who had published a small, vague article about irregular prisoner movements, and the article had found its way to a researcher on the Senate staff who had connected it to the broader investigation. Aldous had not intended to expose anything. He had simply answered a local reporter's questions about what the war had been like, and in the course of that conversation had mentioned a night he spent sitting in a jeep outside a farmhouse while his sergeant went inside with a German prisoner and a man in civilian clothes. Whitmore was called before Greer in a formal deposition in a requisitioned office building in Frankfurt. He sat across the table from the aide and 2 Army lawyers and realized within the first 5 minutes that Greer was not interested in sending anyone to prison. He was interested in building a record, a paper record, of what had happened, so that the Senate subcommittee could satisfy itself that the operations being run in the final weeks of the war had some form of accountability attached to them, even retroactively. This changed everything about how Whitmore answered the questions. He had spent 3 months maintaining a story built entirely on silence and denial. And that story had cost him sleep and appetite and the easy conscience he had carried through 4 years of combat. Sitting across from Greer, he made a decision in the space of a single breath. He told the truth, not all of it. He left out Werner Holtz and the buried documents entirely, because that thread was still active and still classified above anything he had clearance to discuss. But he confirmed the farmhouse. He confirmed Kessler. He confirmed that the order had come from above Captain Voss, and that he had been told explicitly to leave no record. The room was very quiet when he finished. One of the army lawyers leaned over and spoke quietly to the other. Greer wrote something on a legal pad. Then he looked up at Whitmore and asked a single follow-up question. Had Whitmore at any point received a direct communication from General Patton regarding this operation? Whitmore said no, because it was true. He had never spoken to Patton, never received anything with his signature or voice attached to it. The order had come through Voss, and Whitmore had only ever known the name because Voss had spoken it once in a field. Greer nodded slowly and wrote something else. The deposition ended 30 minutes later. As Whitmore was leaving, Greer stopped him at the door and said, quietly and without ceremony, that Whitmore had done something difficult and that it had been noted. Whitmore walked out into the Frankfurt street and stood in the autumn light and felt the weight he had been carrying shift in a way he could not quite name, lighter in some places and heavier in others. In November of 1945, a sealed box of documents was recovered from a farmhouse in Bavaria by a team of American intelligence officers acting on coordinates provided by Werner Holtz, who had been quietly transferred to a facility in the American sector after his sister was located in the Soviet zone and brought across through a channel that cost 3 months of negotiation and one exchange that was never publicly acknowledged. The documents in the box were exactly what Holtz had described: the complete technical records of the research program's final phase, written in precise scientific German, covering work that had been conducted in the last 18 months of the war under conditions that the researchers themselves had apparently documented with disturbing thoroughness. Among the documents was a single page that had nothing to do with the technical records. It was a handwritten note and signed, dated 3 weeks before Germany's surrender, addressed to no one by name, but clearly intended for whoever eventually found the box. The note described a conversation. It described an American general who had been informed of the program's existence through a back channel before the war ended, who had made a personal decision to intervene and extract the program's lead scientist before official intelligence operations could reach him, and who had done so specifically to prevent the extraction from becoming a formal operation that would require Soviet involvement under the terms of the Allied agreements governing shared access to German scientific personnel. The note did not name the general, but the date of the described conversation, the location, and the description of the American officer's manner and physical presence left very little room for interpretation among the people who read it. The document was classified at the highest available level the same afternoon it was translated. The intelligence officer who filed the classification report noted in his own private journal, discovered decades later by his daughter, that he had never in his career classified something so quickly or with so little discussion, and that the 2 senior officers who reviewed the translation had exchanged a single look before one of them picked up a telephone and made a call that ended the meeting. Whitmore was never shown the document. He learned of its existence 11 years later, in 1956, from a retired intelligence officer he met at a veterans gathering in Cincinnati, a man who had been part of the team that recovered the box and who had spent a decade deciding whether telling someone constituted a security violation or a historical obligation. The retired officer said very little, but enough. He told Whitmore that the thing Whitmore had been part of had been larger than Whitmore knew, and that it had ended in a way that protected the right people, and that the document at the center of it was still classified and would probably remain so for longer than either of them would be alive to see. Whitmore drove home from Cincinnati in silence. His wife asked him at dinner why he was so quiet, and he told her he had run into someone from the old days, and it had brought things back. She accepted this because she had learned over 11 years not to push on the silences that came from that period of his life. He sat on the porch after dinner and watched the street and thought about a farmhouse in Germany, a lamp on a table, a thin old man with shaking hands, and an order that had arrived without paperwork and departed the same way. He thought about the things that history records and the things it buries, and how the distance between those two categories is almost always measured in decisions made by men who understood exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. Patton died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in a car accident, 12 days before he was scheduled to return to the United States and face the political consequences of a career that had become too large and too difficult for the Army to manage quietly. The operation involving Friedrich Kessler was never officially acknowledged. The classified document from the Bavarian farmhouse was partially declassified in 1998 with significant redactions. Dale Whitmore died in 1979 in Columbus, Ohio, and left behind no written account of what he had seen. Werner Holz's sister reached the American sector in January 1946 and settled in West Germany. She never spoke publicly about the circumstances of her transfer. Most people know how World War II ended. Very few know what happened inside these prison camps. Subscribe for more Untold WWII stories.